Hello, I'm going to briefly talk you through the evaluation for reductionism and then the holism side of it, just in case anyone's a little bit confused by what you're reading. So, essentially, because human behaviour is so complex and involves so many different variables, scientists sometimes adopt a reductionist view because it allows them to kind of isolate variables and study specific things. So, by kind of operationalising certain variables, you can establish causality, which means that your results are more valid. You can then replicate procedures and results should be reliable. So it tends to make the approach to studying it more scientific. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's fantastic and it'll tell you all about behaviour, but it's just a way of studying that then leads to a more kind of scientific outcome, or at least that's what they argue. Because human beings are biological organisms, it's possible to reduce even complex behaviours down to those basic neurophysiological components. So we talked about, genes and hormones and things like that, brain structures. Now, what this means is you've got the advantage of biological reductionism, which is very scientific, collects lots of quantitative data, there's lots of control over variables, and you can easily operationalize things. So, therefore, it is usually more reliable. You can kind of make predictions about behavior and sometimes be right about it. So, it's quite attractive because it's quite a simplistic way of explaining behavior by reducing it down to those constituent parts. However, as a kind of negative, weakness of taking this reductionist viewpoint is that it can lead to things like selective breeding. So we learn about, the forced sterilisation of people based on the IQ research, and also test tube babies and things like that, where you can select certain characteristics that you want your baby to have or not have. It means that people are almost viewing things like genes as having a kind of cause and effect outcome, and it's a lot more complex than that. One gene doesn't do one thing. It's a kind of complex interaction. So by being reductionist, you're not really fully explaining that behaviour. And whilst it seems to be more scientific, it's not really the full explanation. So it's neglecting this idea that things can interact with each other, and it's neglecting this idea that there might be some kind of emergent properties, which is more the kind of holism side of the debate. So some strengths of reductionism, you might want to write in your notes that all of these are AO3, so that to kind of bulk out the point on the previous slide, because you're reducing things down, you're reducing that complex behaviour down to simple terms, it means you can measure it more accurately, it's possible to operationalise things, and it can be more scientific, allows for that establishment of causal relationships, knowing that this factor causes that behaviour. Although, you could criticise that and say, is that even ever really possible? However, if you can establish a cause for behaviour, then it does allow you to provide treatments. So you might want to add to this point about having practical applications and it being useful. Really good example of this. So for each of these evaluation points, strengths and weaknesses, it would be really useful for you to put a study in to illustrate it. So the Little Albert research, which was Watson and Rayner, they showed that Little Albert had a phobia of a white rat because of classical conditioning. So they've isolated that variable, they've reduced it down to environmental reductionism, where it's stimulus response that's caused the behaviour. And they can treat that using systematic desensitisation, which is the obvious reverse engineering of classical conditioning. And so therefore that's really useful and it's got practical applications. If we didn't know what that kind of component part was, that constituent part was, we wouldn't be able to really provide a treatment because it'd be a lot more complex. You'd have to consider a lot more factors and it probably wouldn't be as useful. So you can make that as a strength of reductionism. So there's 2 points there for you to expand on. And then weaknesses of reductionism. It is oversimplistic. It's ignoring complex interactions between things. I was mentioned before about the genes. There's an example here of nature nurture. We've got some evidence that there's the role of biology and upbringing in an individual's development of criminal behaviour, but they don't really know exactly if it's not that it's just genes and biology, things like that, or it's just environmental. It's an interaction of the two, and there's actually new research in biology called epigenesis and epigenetics, which is where your genes get triggered based on environmental factors. So genes are more likely to be expressed or less likely to be expressed depending on the environmental circumstances. So people might have a predisposition towards a certain behaviour, but unless the environmental conditions are, fostering that, it's not going to be expressed. And in this example, somebody wouldn't develop criminal behaviour even though they've got a gene that makes them more likely to. So holism would suggest it's more appropriate to look at the contributions of each of nature and nurture and how they interact and things like that to actually understand behaviour. It seems very simplistic to just say, oh, it's just that component part, and when you add these component parts up, it'll explain behaviour. It's ignoring that interaction and that kind of so I keep mentioning these emergent properties that might happen. I'll talk more about holism in a minute so that it makes a little bit more sense. Also, massive weakness of reductionism, which builds on the previous point about, they argue that it's scientific, but if it was scientific, you'd be able to predict behaviour. So with all kind of natural sciences, you can predict behaviour of how atoms are going to behave and things like that, or generally, obviously not in the kind of quantum arena anymore, but we can't predict everyone's behaviour. We don't know exactly how everyone's going to behave because people behave differently every time. So it can't be beneficial to look at behaviour in a reductionist way because we can't fully explain everyone's behaviour. We can't predict what they're going to be like. It means that there must be some factors that are interacting there that we've not kind of thought about. An example being, you might have a family where the genetic makeup's quite similar, the environment's quite similar, but they're all very different. So it's like, why is that? It must be a bit more complicated than just saying that it's, nature and nurture in this example. Obviously, reductionism can be in other ways as well. So, for example, you might think about a behaviour where, so for example, memory, you might think of that from a biological perspective, you might think of that from a cognitive perspective, you might think of that from a social and cultural perspective, which we'll get onto later. And so they might all interact with each other. It might not make sense to kind of reduce them all down to these single components because they might interact. Remember that car example from before? Looking at kind of the reductionist way of explaining that car, just looking at the engine and how the parts interact with each other. It might not tell you about how the person drives the car and the interaction of that, which we'll talk a little bit more when we do holism. So holism, holistic, this is where you refer to the whole person rather than constituent parts, or the whole explanation rather than, component parts of that explanation. This side of the debate would say that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So reductionism is all about looking at the different bits, and they think if you add them all together, you can get a full explanation of the whole. But holism would say that that's not the case because when things interact with each other, you get emergent properties. So an example being, if you were to look at kind of the mind and how it functions and add up all the explanations, you can't explain an emergent property like consciousness. We can't really explain that. So there's things going on that we can't fully explain through reductionism. So it might not be the best explanation for behaviour to take a reductionist approach. So holism suggests that we've got different levels of explanation and that there are these emergent properties that interact with each other. And so it doesn't make sense to reduce it to the lowest one, which is usually biology, so the biological reductionism one. The other things will interact with that. So, for example, I mentioned before about epigenetics, the environment interacts with that biology. It doesn't make sense to just suggest that it's a biological explanation. Now, an example of a holistic approach is humanism. So the humanistic approach, if you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it takes into account the entire person, that, you're working towards self-actualization. It doesn't just kind of reduce it down to a single constituent part. And the type of data collected in the holism side of the debate would be qualitative because you want in-depth, rich information about the real reasons for behaviour and all the different kind of explanations. Whereas conversely, the reductionism, because it's scientific, is more quantitative data, not giving you that kind of insight. Now, if you think about a cake, if I was to reduce a cake down to its component constituent parts, I'd be looking at the ingredients. Now, that means that I'd be looking at these ingredients to explain the cake. So if you think about this as a metaphor for human behaviour, if I was to reduce human behaviour down to its ingredients, that should tell me about the overall behaviour. Now, if you think about a cake, when you put the cake in the oven and you mix all the ingredients together, they're all interacting with each other and you get emergent properties like the taste of the cake and, you know, what the cake feels like and sponginess and all of that kind of stuff that you wouldn't know just looking at the ingredients. So if you think about that in terms of the human behaviour, you'll know the different parts of it, but you won't necessarily know how it interacts and any emergent properties that come out of that. So it's quite difficult to fully understand human behaviour if you take a reductionist perspective. It's more scientific because you can isolate variables and operationalise them, establish causality, and they're reliable and all that kind of stuff. But it might not actually truly tell you the real, you know, understanding of that behaviour. If we think back to the car, we talked about reductionism being, you know, the parts interacting with each other in the kind of engine. But if you were being holistic, you'd look at the clutch and the gear stick and how they actually all work together, and the steering wheel. You'd think about the person sat in the car that's working it and the direction of the vehicle and their eyes and their arms and their legs and the cognitive process that they might be making, like their attention and decision making. And then you might think about the social and cultural factors, so how people actually drive the car. I don't know if you've ever been to another country, but they drive very differently because it's a cultural thing. I remember when I was in Thailand, they beep the horn as they're going around corners so that they can, you know, say, oh, I'm here, because they drive quite erratically compared to our culture. So all of these things will interact and work together, and then you'll get a full explanation of driving that car. But if you're just being reductionist, you're just looking at how the engine's working, it might not be a full explanation. It might not give you that insight into the behaviour. You might kind of understand it on the surface, but you might not really kind of understand the true reasons. Let's have a look at this image. Dots on a page. Is there anything that's emerging for you? So any kind of emergent property there? A lot of people say that they can see a Dalmatian dog. And so this would be an example of an emergent property. There's no Dalmatian dog there. This is the idea behind the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If I was to look at all the different parts of vision, I might not necessarily be able to explain how we can see a Dalmatian. So this is an example that you can use for holism to support that it's more appropriate to take a holistic view for certain things. So visual perception works holistically. It's based on Gestalt psychology, which suggests that you need to view things as a whole and in context of each other. If you look at this image here, there is no white triangle there, but our brain sees it because we're viewing the image holistically. If we were viewing it in individual parts, so looking at the kind of circle with a bit cut out and, you know, lines and things, we wouldn't be able to see that white triangle. So vision must be working holistically for our brains to kind of perceive that. So therefore it would make more sense when we're studying visual perception to take a holistic viewpoint. Again, another example here. This is a side-on face and a front-on face merged into one, but you can kind of see both of them and they kind of make sense. If you were processing this in a kind of reductionist way by just looking at different parts of it, it probably wouldn't make sense to you. But because your brain is perceiving it as a whole, it can kind of, you know, make an understanding of that image. So holism is the theory that the parts of any whole cannot exist and cannot be understood except in relation to the whole. So it's really important to understand behaviour in context, to look at things and how they interact with each other. So qualitative methods are usually used. The humanistic approach is more holistic. You can evaluate the approaches used in this debate. And social psychology as well takes quite a holistic view, because you do look at the social context of behaviour. You do look at, you know, why people obey, for example, and you look at kind of the social things around that, and conformity and stuff like that as well. How it changes over the years, when we look at kind of temporal validity when we're evaluating studies. Also, if you think about something like social learning theory, for example, it looks at the impacts of a role model on your behaviour, so observing and imitating that role model, but it's also got that mediation process, which is more of a cognitive thought process, so it's kind of integrating that into it, so it's more than one kind of constituent part and component. Now, another example that you can use is Coller's research. This is into insight learning. So they had a chimpanzee that was quite hungry in a cage, and they placed a banana just out of its reach, and they gave it a stick, outside the cage, which was within reach. And the monkey, chimpanzee, was kind of just like not really doing anything for a while, and then just picked the stick up and got the banana. And so the suggestion is that this insight learning, the chimpanzee must have had in its head the concept of the stick and the arm and the movements needed to reach that banana, to be thinking about all that, to then suddenly know how to get the banana. So I want you to watch the video on the next slide and look at the kind of peanut example is another one where there was no kind of trial and error, it was just insight learning. They just knew how to kind of solve the problem. So pause this, watch the video, and then come back and I'll carry on talking through these slides. So this is the video here. Now, the evaluation for holism is like the opposite of reductionism. You know, you've got the disadvantage of it's not scientific at all. You can't establish causality. There's no kind of one constituent part that explains the behaviour if you're taking a holistic approach, which means that treatments are quite difficult to administer. However, the flip side of that is you could say they can be tailored more to the individual, because you can look at all the different parts of a person and address those. So, for example, in humanism, person-centered therapy, so the one that Rogers devised, is really good because you kind of thinking about the person as a whole, rather than just kind of looking at a component part like CBT, where you just look at, you know, negative automatic thoughts and the way that they're thinking about things. So it can be kind of better in that way. So just note a few down of those. If you can watch the video on the slide, so not this one's kind of a short one, which is 8 minutes long, which will give you an explanation of what we've just spoken through. So you can watch this one, and it'll also talk you through levels of explanation. But there's a video right at the end, which is called like a webinar one, which has got this bit at the front of it, and then it's got how to answer exam questions at the end of it. So you can either watch this one, then miss out the beginning of the next one, or just watch the next one. So have a watch of that. Now, levels of explanation is also something that you need to know. So this is AO1 stuff. So this is different levels of kind of reductionism. So it's all been discussed on the video. This is the image from the video. You might want to write down this one as an example. So we've learned about memory being a psychological explanation. So it's a cognitive explanation with Miller and Peterson and all that kind of stuff. But you can also look at it from a biological explanation with Maguire, so we learned about that in biopsych. And we also did mention, or Hannah would have mentioned with you if you had her last year, the social and cultural explanation, the War of the Ghost with Bartlett, the schema theory, where it was people remembered the story in the context of the culture. So if they were from a Western culture, they remembered like boats. But if they were from the culture that it was in, I think it's like an Eastern culture, or maybe, I don't know, in fact, it might have been Native American culture, they remembered canoes instead. And like there was a difference between seals and fish, and just little things like that, where your culture had an impact on what you actually remembered. So that might be a good example to note down. This is another example. So we've got 3 explanations here for depression. So pause the video and have a think about which one would be biological, which one would be psychological, and which one would be social and cultural. So the faulty levels of neurotransmitter serotonin causing depression would be a biological explanation, so that's a lower level. The depression is caused by faulty thought processing would be the psychological one, the cognitive one. And then the middle one, about society, men being thought of as masculine, therefore can't talk about their feelings, would be a social cultural explanation. So these are all explanations for depression, but depending on the level of reductionism that you take, depends on kind of what you're explaining it as. And with this triangle, the ones that are at the bottom, so the biological ones, are more reductionist than the ones that are closer to holism, the social and cultural ones. So this is in your worksheet pack, and you've got these on the back of it. So if you can pop them into that. There isn't something for every box, so you might want to fill in the kind of gaps. So have a go at that, pause this, then come back to it. These are the answers, so you can check these. You might want to put in this one, actually, there's evolutionary origins for phobias. People are more likely to be scared of snakes and spiders than like houses and cars. even though cars are very dangerous. So you can pop that in that low level one if you want. For the middle level of conformity, you might want to put in informational social influence and normative social influence, because they have an impact on whether you you conform to a group. And then the depression one, you might put in those kind of faulty thought processes from before. You don't need all of these, but this is just a good example of something that you could write about in the Reductionism AO1, so Soviet A1 stuff. Now, a common misconception in reductionism, so you do need to write this one down, is that a lot of people write something like this. So they say, taking one explanation and ignoring all others. This isn't correct. This is not what reductionism is. Even though, on the very first video that I showed you did mention something like this. It's just a common misconception that people don't quite get their mind around. So make sure you don't do this. One example, just to kind of make it clear, is social learning theory. So a student might say social learning theory is reductionist because it ignores the role of biology, which is incorrect, because in psychology, to be scientific, we have to kind of look at things and think about what the explanation might be. We can't consider all factors, therefore. So just because we don't consider those factors doesn't mean that we're saying that those factors don't explain it, which means that we're not being reductionist, because we're just not looking at them because we don't have the time or the the money or practical reasons or whatever. Because as well, if you took this viewpoint, you'd be saying everything's reductionist, because that's just the way we conduct research in psychology. And actually, SLT is actually quite holistic, because, as I mentioned before, it doesn't just look at a component part and say that that's the reason for the behaviour. Social learning theory looks at social stuff like role models, observing and imitating those, and it also looks at the mediation process, which is cognitive, and it's looking at the interaction between those. So it's actually quite a holistic theory for that reason. So if you were to say that social learning theory is reductionist, you'd be completely wrong. You might want to write this down. The only ones that are really reductionist are biological and behaviourist approaches, because they're reduced down to that simple element, component part, constituent part of a gene or neurotransmitter for biology, or brain structure or whatever, and stimulus response for behaviourists. So unless you've got a kind of component part, I would avoid saying that it's reductionist, really. Your component part might be just simply cognitive as well. So you can do, and there's something in the memory topic where it's a reductionist point, so you can talk about that. But these ones are probably the better ones to talk about. So make sure you make a note of that. There's a worksheet that you can fill in to kind of summarise this if you like, so you've got everything in one place. There's a true and false activity here, so if you want to pause this, have a go at whether you think these are true or false, and then I'll show you the answers on the other slide. These are the answers. You can check these. Any that you've not quite got right, you might want to go back and have a look at. And then there's quite a lot of short marker questions in your pack of worksheets that you can have a go at. This can see if you actually understand what we've kind of been talking through. And there are mark schemes at the end of it, so if you can check those and self-mark them, you'll be able to know if you're doing them right. There's on here that you can have a look at if you need. And then finally, the 16 marker. So there's quite a few different worksheets to help you. As always, make a plan, put some evidence in there, some examples of studies, so you need to find some of those, and then practice writing them out.